So it seems that Poland has had more than its share of tragedy recently. Just before Christmas, there was an accident where 12 Polish miners were killed in a coal mine. Then in the early part of January, 5 Polish teenage girls were killed in an escape room accident. And last Sunday, the 13th, probably the most shocking incident of all, the mayor of the city of Gdansk, Paweł Adamowicz, was killed, murdered actually, on stage during the finale of a nationwide charity event. He died the Monday after from his wounds. He leaves behind a wife and 2 young children. He was 53 years old. We're very late to this story, of course. This happened last week, about 3 hours after we recorded. So we're coming to this again a week later. So we're going to use some of the information we've learned in the last week to try to put everything together and give you a kind of a complete picture of what we know up to this moment. All right, guys, let's start with just the facts of the case, what we know for sure, and then we'll transition to kind of a different take on things. We're going to do what the Polish media is doing, which is speculate on what it all means and, talk about the political aspect of it all. But again, first, let's start by sticking with the facts. So, Josh and Dr. Mike, where can we start? What's the jumping in point here for this whole thing?
I guess we can start just off with the actual event itself. On Sunday the 13th, a few minutes before 8 o'clock in the evening, Paweł Adamowicz, the mayor of Gdańsk, went up on stage during the charity event to give a speech, celebrate the event, boost morale.
Now, this is the VOSP, which just by coincidence is what we talked about last Sunday, right before it happened. Yeah.
Exactly. They were, kids running around with cans, collecting money, bands playing music. He's up on stage congratulating everybody, saying how beautiful this event is, and so forth. And then out of nowhere, just about 8 o'clock, a man runs up on stage, stabs him 3 times. From we now know it was in the chest, so he in the heart, in the diaphragm, in the upper abdomen, and then runs up to the microphone and starts spouting kind of random words, talking about that he was arrested unjustly by the PO government, spent time in jail, was wrongly accused. And only after about 30 seconds or a minute and a half, something like that, he was actually wrestled down by some other people there.
I think it was like the stagehand, some of the technical crew that were there for the event, not by the security.
The police showed up very quickly, but not right away.
Yeah, we'll talk about the police in just a minute. Yeah.
Adamowicz was then, he was being resuscitated, emergency care for about 30 minutes before then they decided, they didn't decide, but they had to take him to hospital. Operation lasted about 5 hours. He was on what is technically life support, extra circulatory support. His heart wasn't functioning properly, he wasn't breathing properly. Everything was, hooked up to machines. But the next day, unfortunately, after even all that effort, he was pronounced dead due to the injuries that he had sustained that evening.
Mike, let me ask you, and I know obviously you weren't there and you didn't see the medical charts, and we're just kind of speculating, but you are a doctor here. Can you kind of help me understand how a stab to the heart is something even the best surgeon can't overcome? Because I think he spent like 5 hours on the operating table. What is it about this kind of injury that makes it almost unrepairable?
Well, the problem is this heart has to, sustain blood flow to the entire body. As soon as the heart, for some reason, its structural integrity is disrupted, blood going into the heart doesn't pump into the heart, it pumps into the cavity around. Blood isn't pumped to the lungs, so air isn't being circulated. Resuscitation is very difficult then, because you might be physically actually massaging the heart or the chest cavity, but blood isn't being forced into the vessels and arteries that it needs to go to. So, you have to open up the chest cavity right away, actually go for the heart, try to suture it closed, but at the same time hook him up to equipment that allows blood to be continuously pumped through the body, so the body is still being oxygenated. And if you don't get this right, there isn't enough oxygen getting to the rest of the body. The heart isn't functioning properly. Suturing up a moving muscle is not easy for obvious reasons, and they knew that his chances of survival were slim. They still had a lot of experts put in their best efforts, but unfortunately it wasn't enough.
Yeah, so his his death from the wounds in no way reflects upon the quality of the medical care that he received. Yeah.
No, he got the best medical care right away. It's like he was in hospital within 30 minutes after resuscitation, after everything that could have been done on the spot.
You mentioned the police. That was one of the first questions that started on the internet the following day, is that where were the police? How could they allow this to happen? And it's an understandable question, even if it's very unfair. I'm not sure how the police are supposed to anticipate and stop this kind of attack. But it's important to know that this event, the charity event, under Polish law, it's called a private party, a private event. Now, obviously, it was open to the public. Anybody could go, but it's private in the sense that a private organization asked for permission from the city to use that space and set up the stage and whatnot. And it's just like a concert here in the main square in Krakow or at a football match in the stadium. It's a private event. And under Polish law, the organizers of a private event are responsible for the security. Now, that security can be supplemented by the police, and often is, because you have, a large number of people in one place. It becomes a public safety issue. But the primary responsibility for the safety of the participants is one of the responsibilities of the organizer of the event. So that's what private security is for. So the police are really not the first line of defense here. The private security agency is called Typhoon. They immediately were put under a microscope to see if their hiring practices were, consistent with, professional standards and good practices. And, apparently, they were as well run as any organization really can be. Hiring the right people, you can find some problems with their training policies, but nothing that can be directly linked to what happened on stage. The big problem from a security point of view is not the role of the police or even the private security agency. The big problem seems to be the fact that this guy got on stage with a media pass around his neck.
That's one of the theories right now. That's one of the stories that's being told.
And I've been unable to confirm if this is true or not. And if he did have it, where did he get this media pass? What do we know about this?
There's a lot of conflicting information on this issue. And the private security company said, he had a media pass. We now know that it was faked. Other people are saying that he actually jumped the fence. You have to also understand that this kind of event was pretty open. It was like a joyous event.
And the security risk is perceived to be extremely low, or as low as it can be. Yeah, it's not like a controversial political protest.
No, this is like this president. This wasn't a president that had bodyguards. I mean, I have to mention as well that in Poland, the mayors of large cities are referred to as presidents. So President Adamowicz, he didn't usually have a security detail. There was no suspicion that his life was in any way being threatened. And this was an open event, a party basically. And somebody got on stage that shouldn't have gotten on stage, but might have just been a spectator. But at that time, they're claiming that he had a media pass. That's why he got so close. People are also complaining about the fact that other people were being frisked for alcohol or fireworks, but somehow this individual wasn't frisked. Nobody noticed that he had a huge knife on him, a 30-centimeter knife. So something that a simple search would have exposed right away. But he somehow got onto stage and, without being interrupted, walked up to the mayor and stabbed him multiple times. And the reaction on the part of the security there was a little lagging. Yeah,
the reaction seems to be the biggest problem here. As we mentioned a minute ago, it was two members of the technical crew, like the sound and lighting people, that actually physically restrained him after he stabbed Adamowicz. It wasn't the private security people. Now, whether that was because they weren't present where they should have been and they didn't see it, we don't know. I'm not suggesting that anyone on the private security team saw what happened and failed to react. That's a little bit hard to believe, although at this point we still don't know. But again, between the police and the private security people, you'd think that there would be a quicker reaction than there was, but that's how things turned out.
There's also something else we should mention, that this event wasn't presented to the local authorities as actually a party or a large public gathering or event, something like that. When you have a large public event, you have to get certain permits, and you also have to make sure that there is an ambulance on site and certain security precautions are being taken into account. They didn't do that. They announced this basically just as a open event, something along the lines of, having a stand on a sidewalk. It's easier to get through all the bureaucracy then. You don't need to worry about an ambulance and all these safety precautions, et cetera, et cetera. And now a lot of people are like commenting and criticizing the organizers of the charity that why didn't you guys go through all the formalities that we believe you should have gone through?
Yeah, as is often the case when something like this happens and the media and the government, the police, they start to do a deep dive into everybody involved. They sometimes find things that are a little bit embarrassing for certain people. That in retrospect, in hindsight, they are red flags that nobody acted on. And we found a couple of them here. One of them being that the mother of the assailant, the murderer, we're calling him Stefan W. What are we calling him?
Well, if you go on most foreign language websites, they'll actually put a surname on. But according to Polish law, when somebody is being charged with a crime, you cannot actually say their full name. So he's Stefan W.
Yes,
or Stefan
It's
V.
alleged, no matter how comically obvious it is that he actually did it.
There's video on YouTube with him doing it, then screaming out his name, apparently.
Well, let's call him Stefan W.
Yeah.
The Stefan W.'s mother, his mother, 8 days before this happened, she contacted the police. And she told them, I'm concerned about my son, about his behavior. I'm concerned he's going to hurt somebody. Because this guy had a long and in addition to his long and documented criminal history, he had a long and documented history of mental health problems as well. Yeah.
Yeah, we should definitely mention all this. He just recently got out of jail late December.
The bank robbery?
Bank robbery, armed robbery, violent offenses. And while in prison, he actually did spend time in a psychiatric ward this is all speculation. His medical records aren't out there, but this is what is being reported, that he spent time in a psychiatric ward, that he was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and he was being treated, and that he was generally a problematic inmate. He was released in December, and before even going home for Christmas, he first went to Warsaw, apparently. Nobody knows really why. We can talk about that in a moment. But he was being treated. He had issues, and his mother informed the police that something is wrong with my son. The police apparently passed on this information to prosecutors, to the proper authorities, but they didn't mention that this is information from the mother. It's just one more thing to stick in the file. This is somebody else's problem, et cetera, and no action was being taken.
But wait, that's not it. That wasn't the only red flag. There were 3 more red flags, actually. It also was learned this week that a childhood friend of Stefan W., I named, Tobias. Well, his name is also protected, so it's Tobias L. After getting out of prison, Stefan threatened this friend. I don't know what kind of friendship this was, but threatened his friend 3 times. 3 times that he would kill him. He says, I'm going to kill you. And he threw bricks at his home and whatnot. Three different times. And 3 different times, this Tobias told the police that he's threatening me. I'm afraid for my life. He's threatening to kill me. So counted separately, that's 4 different times. 4 different times that 2 different people went to the police and said, look, this guy is acting like this. We're concerned about his behavior, and nothing. So not sure what to make of this.
Nothing. You can't make anything good out of it, that's for sure. And, well, the police are basically saying, like, what could have we done? We gathered these reports, we passed it on to the next level up. And this was something, it all happened within a couple of weeks. He wasn't the kind of inmate that they were following up on. He just, he served his sentence and he was released. His medical and mental health issues weren't taken into account. The fact that apparently he had stopped taking his medication was also not somehow noted, because there was no court order requiring him to get further treatment or to continue his treatment.
Let's switch to Adamowicz himself. He was 53 years old when he died. He had been the mayor of Gdansk since 1990, 20 years, is that right?
Yep, he was just starting his 21st year as mayor, won the elections back in the fall, quite contested. Adamowicz is an interesting personality, politically speaking. He was involved with, say, the anti-communist movement in the 80s, but as a teenager in the printing press in high school, so nothing too serious. In his university, continued that kind of work, but he wasn't the kind of the anti-communist leader that some people try to play him out to be.
But last week and for the last couple of years, I think he was technically ex-PO. He was ex-Platforma, yeah?
Oh, yes.
What are the circumstances of him leaving the party?
Well, first we have to figure out his whole political career started in the 90s. And he was actually one of the people who started with Platforma right in the early days, one of the founding members, one of the founding groups up in Gdansk. But a few years ago, some things popped up that weren't very favorable to his political career. It turns out that he hadn't been completely honest on his financial declarations. You know, when you run for office in Poland, you have to say how much money you have, how much property you own, et cetera, et cetera. Turns out that he didn't put down exactly how much money he had, how many properties he owned, how much they were worth, where he got the money from. And PO decided, and this all went to court, and it's been in and out of court now for several years. And PO, a couple of years ago, decided to cut ties with him. He suspended his membership, and after a year, his membership basically
It was not a friendly breakup. It doesn't sound like he left, more like kicked out.
Basically, yeah, PO didn't want to have anything to do with him because he was tainted goods or damaged goods, basically.
But this did not affect his popularity amongst the electorate in Gdansk.
In Gdansk, he was very popular, and this is actually for a couple of reasons. First of all, he was like a local patriot. That's how often he's explained. Something that actually annoys a lot of, like, say, peace members who talk about, like, Polish patriotism. Well, he was more about Gdansk patriotism, local patriotism. Because you have to also remember that Gdansk was for a long time a free city, kind of a quasi-German city. And
kind of a separate identity in some ways.
Yeah, and he would
Polish
like kind of a similar situation as you have in Śląsk and Silesia, where people have local patriotism parallel to their Polish patriotism, and certain political parties in Poland really don't like that. And he gained a lot of popularity locally. So even now when these elections came around, he ran as an independent. Both PO and PiS ran candidates against him. And PO actually ran Jarosław Wałęsa, which is the son of former President Lech Wałęsa. And
you think you have some name recognition?
Exactly, and Wałęsa didn't win, so into the next round of elections went Adamowicz and the PiS candidate, and
so PO actually tried to knock him off.
Tried to knock him off, but in the second round they endorsed him. So,
okay, just to circle back to the alleged, supposed murderer, Stefan W., he made some kind of declaration when he was on stage for those few seconds before he was subdued. He made some kind of declaration, some kind of reference to the fact that he was wrongly imprisoned due to PO. Yeah?
Yeah, it's not quite clear what he was going on about, because his arrests had nothing to do with politics. You know, he was basically caught robbing banks. You know, there was a lot of evidence. There was nothing political here. There were no appeals suggesting that, you know, prosecutors were somehow going after him. But he blamed it on the PO government, on the courts, wrongly accused, et cetera, et cetera. It didn't really make much sense, but just by mentioning the political party, it made the whole murder, the whole attack political. So now it's being called by a lot of people an assassination.
Okay, well, on that note, I guess that's a good segue to kind of move on to a different, kind of come at this whole subject from a different angle. So let's draw a line here. Let's draw a line, say it's a horrible tragedy, awful what happened. And as is, again, often the case, it's being politicized because this kind of event gives... it's a kind of hammer that one side tries to pick up and smash the other side in the head with, and gain some kind of political advantage. And it's horrible that this kind of thing happens so soon in the aftermath of a tragedy like this, but within 24 hours, the finger pointing had already started. Right?
24 hours.
Okay, 12 hours?
I'm pretty sure that it was that same day. I'm seeing on Facebook information, you know, about this murder, this attack. I turn on the TV, and people are always saying, we can't politicize this, we can't politicize this. But
now let's politicize this. Exactly.
You know, it's too early to speculate.
And as you said, I think the fact that he did make this reference, apparently made this reference to PO being responsible for him being in prison, and here he is murdering a former PO politician, you know, gives, you know, forms the basis for the idea that it was a politically motivated murder. And after that, the story kind of grows its own legs and it runs off in a million different directions. Yeah.
It's kind of become a complete mess right now. PiS, who basically run the public television and radio networks, have been accused of propagating hate speech to opposition parties, being very negative, both online and on television and on the radio. And after this attack, everybody is saying, or a lot of talking heads are saying, like, look, this is what your hate speech has led to. A person has decided to take, physical action against a politician in response to what they've been hearing all around them. So now hate speech in Poland is becoming a hot button topic.
Yeah, this isn't. I'll get to that in just a minute, because suddenly there are stories about how schools want to organize anti-hate speech campaigns and classes and awareness and things like that. And it's all about hate speech, hate speech, hate speech. You know what I'm not seeing in the news? I don't think I've seen it a single time, is the subject of mental health and access to mental health, therapy or help for people who need it. And that's not a subject at all. And that seems to be much closer to the source of the problem, the source of, the explanation of what really happened, rather than hate speech. But it seems that, mental health and, again, access to help for people who need it is not the sexy political issue, whereas hate speech is, can be used to advance an agenda in a way that mental health cannot.
Actually, if anybody talks about mental health right now and those issues, they're being clumped in together with, internet haters and trolls, which I think is, completely inappropriate. And it's kind of actually scary, because a lot of politicians are putting this crime at the doorstep of quote-unquote hate speech without really talking about what hate speech is, how it pertains to freedom of speech, and how Facebook posts might actually...
What is hate speech? Who gets to define it?
Yeah, and there are already politicians out there saying we need to do something about this. And I'm always scared, I'm always concerned when I hear a politician say something along the lines of, we need to do something about this.
Yeah, but again, I can't stress this enough, and it seems insensitive in the aftermath of such a terrible tragedy, but come on, we're talking about hate speech, but this was not the motivation behind what happened.
It doesn't matter now.
It doesn't matter, exactly, because people are using it to advance
being used as a political tool.
Different agenda. Josh, you're being quiet over there. You want to jump in here?
Well, it's very difficult to add very much more. I mean, of course, from my British perspective, there are kind of some parallels between this terrible case and the tragic case in the UK in the build-up to the European Union referendum, when the Labour MP Joe Cox was murdered by someone who also had mental health issues, but at the time of the murder was kind of yelling slogans kind of with a particular political direction, and you had this kind of factionalized outcome depending on which side of things you stood, whereby on the one hand this person did this terrible thing because of political motivation, kind of incited to go several steps beyond what is deemed acceptable, and on the other hand people saying, well, no, this person clearly had mental health problems, and don't try and drag politics into this.
Exactly. And here we are just 1 week after this happened in Gdansk, and already the conversation has been shifted towards hate speech. And I think about a year from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, when people write the history books, or they look at whatever the future version of Wikipedia is like, and I wonder if there will be any reference to the fact that this guy was just stone cold crazy and not motivated by hate. But I suspect that in the future, the story will be that he hated Paweł Adamowicz because of his politics, and because of that, he murdered him.
Actually, it's very similar to what happened with the assassination/murder of the Polish president Narutowicza back in the interwar period, which was also blamed as a political event. But more and more people are talking about that it was actually just a mentally disturbed individual who got clumped together with the nationalist movement. But I'm very concerned about this when it comes now to speaking about hate speech. What will be defined by hate speech? Who will decide what is hate speech? What will be the laws against it? And there's another factor being talked about here right now is why didn't this guy stay in jail longer? Well, he served out his sentence. Well, but he apparently had some mental disorders. Right now in Poland, you have a legislation that deals with, say, violent offenders, somebody who murdered or raped and did something gruesome, spends time in jail 10, 20, 30 years, and then their sentence is up. And people were concerned, this person might come out and start killing again. So they introduced new legislation saying that if there's any signs that this person is still mentally disturbed at the end of their sentence, we can still lock them up in psychiatric hospitals. That's a little scary because, you served your sentence, but you might still sit there longer in jail. And now they're talking about extending that to situations where somebody was in jail for another crime, But he seems to be going a little bit crazy while he's being locked up here. Maybe we should hold him in captivity
think
a little
about
bit
the
longer.
ways that can be abused, right? For the political agendas or for certain kinds of crimes or whatever. Here's an example of what I was just talking about a second ago about how, the people who get to write the histories of this kind of thing. And this is happening right now. Anne Applebaum, we could do a complete separate show about her someday. One of my least favorite people on the planet. She is the wife of was he the foreign minister, Sikorski? She is the wife of, I believe, the former foreign minister of Poland, Radek Sikorski, from PO. She's American, and she writes for the Washington Post. And she wrote a column this week, just days after Adamowicz's murder. She wrote a column that said that it was a political murder. A political murder. Now, she wrote this in the Washington Post. Now, try to imagine, typical person in the United States getting their news from a supposedly trusted source, and Anne Applebaum, allegedly an expert on these things, says this was a political murder. What are people supposed to think? This is they trust them. It's Anne Applebaum writing in the Washington Post, and she says the assassination of the mayor of Gdansk was a political murder. How are they supposed to know otherwise, right? And this is how this kind of falsehood grows, and the seeds have been planted already, just days after it happened. No mention of his mental illness, no mention of some alternate, some other explanation. No, he hated the mayor of Gdansk because of his politics, and that's why he killed him. And I suspect the same thing will happen in Poland at some point as well. Part of me, I feel bad even making these points and talking about this because we're so close to the tragedy. But I look at the news and I'm thinking, there's another side to this, what I would call the correct side of things, the truthful side of things. Are you frustrated when you look at the news and you see what's, the conversations about hate speech and all the rest of it?
I'm definitely worried because this is a tragedy, but I'll be honest. I didn't know the guy. I don't know his family. Personally, it doesn't affect me. But because of what happened, politicians will now maybe implement new laws or changes in policies that will affect me. And I don't believe those changes in policies and laws will affect me in a positive way.
Here's a couple of things I noticed in the local news. I'm looking at, it's called Nasze Miasto. It's a local news site about Krakow. And there's also one from the Warsaw version of Nasze Miasto. So two different articles, one here, one in Warsaw, and they're both about the same subject, about how schools, this is just days after this happened, schools in both cities, and I suspect in other cities in Poland as well, are suddenly talking about creating programs for students, like young primary school students, about lecturing them on the dangers of hate speech. Now, this is interesting for a couple of reasons. First of all, who's going to stand up and say, no, you can't teach against hate speech? No, you can't. They're using this as a shield to advance their agenda. Any criticism of what they want to do is answered with, what, are you for hate speech? Well, of course we're not. But again, and this can't be repeated enough, nothing we know at the moment indicates that the murder was a result of hate any more than any murder is a result of hate. It was a crazy guy doing things that crazy people do. And unfortunately, it manifested itself in this horrible act of violence. But it wasn't the result of hate. But, they're thinking and talking and advancing as if this is already resolved, that this is a result of hate. And so we have to educate the kids in hate. And just one more thing. I was looking at the Facebook page of Nasze Miasto. I got this thing from a Facebook post. And I'm a big believer in the... what's it called? The vox populi, the popular voice. I think that when you see a story online where the highest rated comment by a huge margin is, it supports this or that view, that tells you something. Now, of course, you have to consider the publication and what kind of audience it has. There are different variables here at work, but Nasze Miasto is basically an apolitical, news site. I trust them, more than I would trust Gazeta Wyborcza, for example. And by far, by a ridiculous huge margin, the number one rated comment, the most likes, was something to the effect of, they're going to teach kids that any criticism of the EU is fascism, that any criticism of LGBT is hatred, that any criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, any criticism of whatever, just almost in cliche, cartoonish. A cartoonist version of, lectures against hate speech. And I can easily believe that. I can easily believe it being so heavily politicized to the left, I have to say to the left, that, it's to make it almost meaningless. And again, completely unnecessary given, I know I'm rambling here, I'm ranting, but completely unnecessary. Again, the guy wasn't murdered as a result of hate. So why are we acting like hate is the biggest threat to Polish society?
Okay, I'm going to, because I actually more or less agree with you, but I'm going to just try and raise, if not a counter-argument, at least perhaps a slightly different perspective on all of this. Firstly, it needs to be borne in mind that this happened in the early evening on live television. There was a huge audience of people there that was people of all ages. There were a vast number of innocent children who one would imagine parents would not like to see witnessing this kind of thing, who did witness an appalling attack. And there must have been very raw, immediate and real feelings about these poor kids are going to go back to school and they're going to somehow have to deal with the emotional consequences of witnessing something appalling. Now, I agree with you, John, and probably with most rational people, that perhaps kind of channeling this all into some notion of we must stop this amorphous concept of hate, and, we must make sure that children don't get kind of somehow indoctrinated in the right kind of behaviour. But I think that how it is manifesting, as you say, is bordering on the absurd, really. You can't teach people not to hate. All you can teach people is to recognise that there are certain types of behaviour, whatever prompts that behaviour, there are certain types of behaviour that are absolutely unacceptable and intolerable within a civil society. And getting up on stage and repeatedly stabbing somebody is a very egregious example of that type of behaviour.
Top of that list, yes. Well, fair enough. I see some parallels here. With what we talked about last week when we were talking about the boar hunt. And what I mean by that is not only is it heavily politicized, and it's kind of a proxy for this political fight, but also people have good intentions and they want to do the right thing, and they react, maybe overreact emotionally, and they advocate things that really do nothing to help the problem. Why aren't the schools in Warsaw and Krakow talking about making kids aware of mental health problems and people who have these issues and what we can do to help them? Why aren't they talking about that? Why are we talking about something that, again, for the 10th time, is not or was not the cause of the tragedy as far as we know? There's nothing to indicate it was the result of hate speech, but we're proceeding as if it were clearly and obviously the result of hate speech. I know I'm going in circles here. This is bothering me. Dr. Mike, jump in.
Well, there are more political gains to be made by talking about hate speech. And I was watching on one of the major news networks, Polish news networks, on Saturday, one of those like breakfast shows where they had a bunch of talking heads from different political parties gathered around talking about hate speech. And one of them asked another woman there, would you consider it hate speech if we're talking about us not wanting asylum seekers or migrants coming into Poland? And
yeah, that'll be hate speech too.
Yeah, sure. And she's basically saying, well, it's not necessarily hate speech, but it depends on the context. For me, that's already a red flag right there. Then she goes on and says, but it is hate speech if, and she's giving an example of something that actually happened, if a politician starts saying like these migrants or asylum seekers or refugees will bring in diseases, that's already hate speech. And I just wanted to scream at the TV right there because no, that is not hate speech. Populations moving around do tend to spread diseases. It could be between cities, between neighborhoods, in the same office building.
Well, they would say if it were, done in a dehumanizing way.
But it even matters.
Like
what I'm trying to say is, with free speech, people can say stuff that is crap. They might not be able to back it up with actual data, or it's just their opinions, or it might even be unpleasant. But the truth is, if you want to have free speech, you have to be open to the possibility that people say things you don't like, you find offensive, and we just have to deal with it. And I'm scared right now.
But I just
want to say something. I am scared. I love to talk and rant about politics. I like to be hyperbolic for comedic effect. But right now, I am seriously concerned and scared where this will go, where this will lead.
They want to expand the definition of hate speech to cover pretty much anything that could be interpreted as remotely offensive to anyone, which puts a chilling effect on all kinds of speech. They talk about, this atmosphere of hatred, which is created by hate speech. And I'm not sure that I agree that that's the situation here, but they certainly want to create an atmosphere of intimidation where people are afraid to express what they really want to say. Let's circle back for a second. There are a couple of things I want to mention back on the factual side of things instead of the commentary side of things here. First of all, in the immediate aftermath of the murder last week, there were a handful of idiots, complete idiots in different parts of the country that made threats online regarding other politicians and other public figures. As, this guy should also be killed, or we should stab this guy. And how stupid can you be? And they were identified by the police, who can move quickly and efficiently when they want to. And these people were identified and arrested. I'm not sure if they're going to be charged. Hell, I'm not sure how that's going to turn out. But basically, this, sending a signal that we need to tone things down a bit, and I kind of agree with that. On top of that, there was the issue of the presence or the lack of presence of Yaroslav Kaczynski at the funeral. Now, this seems to be another one of those things that's going to be politicized no matter what. Now, I'll eliminate the suspense and tell you that he did not go. But had he gone, the spin would have been, oh, look at him trying to, put his face out in front of this tragedy. And, he's kind of hijacking this, and he should kind of, get out of here and let people grieve without his presence. If he doesn't go, it's, oh, you don't even care about what happened. You can't show, you can't pay your respects and whatnot. So he can't win no matter what.
No, we should also point out that both the president and the prime minister were in attendance at the funeral, and a lot of other politicians. No, not
Kaczynski.
No, not Kaczynski. The president and the prime minister were there. But other politicians, stayed away. Sometimes it was just local representatives of parties, not the ones from Warsaw, from other regions coming over. It was a funeral, but a lot of politicians realize that there's, it's something that you don't want to get too involved with, too closely tied down.
Incidentally, I'm not sure about in the case of the prime minister, but I know the President Duda, he was there with the blessings of the family. He'd asked for permission, do you want me to be there? Because, he recognizes that it can be a distraction. Maybe the family doesn't want him there, but I suspect with Morawiecki, the prime minister as well, he also got the consent of the family. And one more thing to mention again on the factual political side of things. PiS, the Law and Justice Party, I'm not sure about PO, but PiS has formally announced that they will not field a candidate in the election that will be held at some point, I guess, to replace Adamowicz. Mike, what do we know about this?
I've heard that's true that they won't be. And I've heard comments going both ways. The one being like, they're trying to be respectful. They don't want to gain any political ground in Gdansk. Other people saying like, no, they're just being cynical. They know they wouldn't win anyway, and they just want to gain some political points by not running a candidate.
What's the process? Is it another election, or is
there will be another election? I believe it's within. Don't hold me to it, but I think it has to be within like about 90 days.
I'm a little curious to see who's going to stand for that. I suspect that there will be an understanding that a single candidate will step forward. I can't imagine an adversarial election to replace him. The current
vice mayor, woman who is currently actually taking charge of the situation, of administrating the city, she'll probably run and she'll probably get the position.
All right. Well, we're going to bring this to a close. Hopefully, that's the last tragedy we have to speak about for a while. As I said earlier, Poland seems to have more than its share lately. Rest in peace, Paweł Adamowicz. And I'm sure this is an issue that will be in the news for weeks and months and years to come. So keep an eye out for other developments in this story. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on the KrakCast.